What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to The Haunted Beard. My name is Jake. Well, I have started a brand new horror franchise series of reviews with A Nightmare on Elm Street. And today I'm going to be talking about A Nightmare on Elm Street 2, Freddy's Revenge. But before I do, if you like videos like this and want to see more, this is what I do on my channel, The Haunted Beard. It is all horror and thriller movie content. So click that subscribe button. I would greatly appreciate it. All right, let's get into the movie. So A Nightmare on Elm Street 2 came out in 1985, and this time we see Freddy Krueger trying to possess our lead character, Jesse, so he can use him as his vessel to continue his reign of terror in the real world. So I'm going to start off this review talking about the positives, and the things that I liked about this movie are this film kind of continues sort of the visual aesthetic to a degree of the first film. In my review for the first movie, I talked about how outside of the dream nightmare sequences, it's actually a really bright and very colorful film. And I feel like part two is also that way. Could just be sort of the aesthetic of the time in the 80s, but there's just a lot of really bright colors. It's really nice to look at, just a lot of bright reds, blues, greens, yellows. So it's really pretty to look at and has just a lot of nice colors. I think the opening sequence is pretty fun. You got Freddy Krueger hijacking a bus as these kids are on their way to school. He takes this thing off road, and you obviously figure out you're in a dream sequence as now this bus is teetering on the edge of this cliff. So just kind of fun sequence there to start things off. The best scene in the movie, though, takes place later on, where Freddy literally breaks through Jesse and enters into the real world and kills Grady. This really has vibes of the original Nightmare on Elm Street. It is extremely well done just in terms of the practical effects are great. It's bloody, it's disturbing. It's just an all-around really intense, really brutal, just a great scene. And it is the best scene in the film. And I think this is a highlight of the entire franchise as well. I think this is a really solid scene. I also want to talk about the subtext of the film because I think it's fairly well known now that this is considered to be a gay horror film. The main actor in the film, Mark Patton, who plays Jesse, is a openly gay actor, and I was reading some trivia and he considered Jesse to be a closeted gay man. And so in addition to that, there's also a handful of, I'd say, pretty obvious now gay subtext throughout this film. And so it adds a really kind of interesting element to the movie because you have this character in Jesse who is dealing with an extremely difficult situation. He doesn't know what to do. He doesn't know how to talk about it. And obviously, in the film, it's him being possessed by Freddy Krueger and Freddy using him as his vessel to go kill people. But if you kind of add that layer into it, it almost becomes this kind of symbolic metaphor, whatever you want to call it, about a man who is closeted and dealing with, struggling to talk about his sexuality and not being comfortable enough to talk about it, I guess. And so there is kind of an added layer of depth to it that I think is interesting, and especially for a film that came out now over 30 years ago, I think this movie deserves to be kind of commended at least a little bit for that. And so it adds kind of an interesting element to this movie that you wouldn't typically get from a film from the 80s. And I think Mark Patton's performance in this movie is pretty good, especially scenes later on where sort of the gravity of the situation is just really weighing down heavily upon him and things like that. And I think he does pretty good overall. I think his performance is pretty solid. Unfortunately, though, that is where my positives for this movie end. Where this film fails for me is in the kill sequences, with the exception of the scene involving Grady. And it's just sorely lacking, I think, in terms of atmosphere and suspense and scares. It just doesn't hit the levels, I think, really anywhere close to the original. But the main issue that I have is this film really kind of sets up a whole new set of rules that totally change and kind of completely disregard what was set up in the original film. it completely changes how Freddy Krueger operates. And now I'm not necessarily against a film in a franchise changing things and doing different things and changing up the formula. But the way they execute those changes, I think, just don't work. And it makes a lot of what happens, for me anyway, extremely confusing, and just kind of gives plot holes and just makes things confusing, and they just don't make sense. So to start off, we get a handful of dream sequences where Freddy wants to use Jesse as his vessel. And there's kind of a cool scene where he says, you are the body and I am the brains, and he wants to take over Jesse. And so these dream sequences are really Jesse sleepwalking. And then we finally get our first kill sequence, which happens 40 minutes into the movie, which is way too long because this movie's only like 85 minutes long. So it's like halfway into the film before we get our first kill scene. And this involves the kill of the gym teacher. And just the entire presentation of this is really confusing because what happens is Jesse gets up out of bed, he goes to an S&M club, his gym teacher sees him there, he takes him to the school, makes him run laps in the middle of the night, and then tells Jesse to get in the shower. His gym teacher goes to the office, he gets bombarded by all these sports balls, then tied up and hung up in the shower, and then Freddy, I guess, decides to take over Jesse's body, and then he kills the teacher. And it's just really confusing because I guess we're supposed to believe that Jesse is sleepwalking through this entire thing, which is just kind of ridiculous. But then also, like, somehow Freddy Krueger is manipulating the gym teacher by attacking him with all the balls and tying up his wrists and dragging him over into the shower and hanging him up on the shower. But the gym teacher isn't asleep, he's awake. And then I guess Freddy decides to finally take possession of Jesse so he can kill the teacher. But the whole lead up before this, the handful of dream sequences you get before this, is the implication is that Freddy can't take over Jesse yet because he needs his consent. Like, Jesse has to allow Freddy inside of him. And so it seems like he needs his consent, but he never gets that in this scene. So if Freddy didn't ever need his consent, then why all the other scenes? Why didn't he just take over Jesse right from the get-go? And then he is found by these police walking naked down the street back home, which leads us to believe he was sleepwalking. So like this whole sequence, he was sleepwalking, which is just ridiculous. And then apparently Freddy didn't need consent to take over his body, and then now Freddy can manipulate people who aren't dreaming. He can manipulate the real world. And the rules here have just kind of completely been changed and gone out the window, and they just don't really make much sense to me. There's also a scene earlier on in the movie involving a bird where one of the birds goes crazy and starts flying around and trying to kill him, and then it explodes. And again, it's like, okay, is Freddy now doing this? Like, how exactly is this happening? Did Freddy make the bird explode? Again, we're in the real world here, so Freddy is now manipulating the real world, I guess. Is he somehow doing it through Jesse? It's just, again, it's all very confusing, and that's really the main issue. I mean, you have a handful of these sequences of Jesse dreaming, Freddy telling him, he wants to use him as his vessel, but none of those sequences are of any consequence. There's not really any sort of creepy factor to them. There's no kills. There's not really any suspense. It's just he's dreaming, and all of a sudden he bumps into Freddy. And there's no, like, immediate threat there because Freddy's not trying to kill him. He wants to inhabit his body. And so there's just a lot of kind of build up in those dream sequences that don't really get you anything. And you finally get kind of the climax where Grady ends up getting killed, which, as great of a scene as that I talked about earlier, I also have issues with that scene because Freddy finally breaks through Jesse and comes out into the real world. And I don't really know how we're supposed to interpret that because clearly, like, there's a massive chest cavity inside right? He breaks through a chest cavity in Jesse, which to me would lead me to believe, oh, well, Jesse's dead now, only he isn't. And so it's like, I don't know if Freddy is now independent of Jesse when he kills Grady. And if he is, then shouldn't Jesse be dead? But if he's not dead, then are we supposed to understand it as Freddy possessed Jesse and then it was Jesse who killed Grady? Again, maybe I'm reading too much into this, but it's just presented in a confusing way. And then you get the whole scene at the pool party where Freddy is now just out and has been let loose in the real lucid world, right? And none of these people are dreaming. He's just out operating like a regular, normal, everyday slasher. And it just I think it just does a disservice to the movie, and it just completely changes his whole MO, and it just feels like a different character, and so it just doesn't really work for me. The whole pool party sequence. I mean, they're trying to like add scare scenes here where like hot dogs start bursting into flames and then Coke cans start popping, and it's like, is this supposed to be scary or suspenseful? And it's just silly and corny and goofy, and it just doesn't work. There's also a scene that happens pretty much during the middle of the whole pool party scene where Lisa, Jesse's girlfriend, they end up finding Nancy's diary earlier on in the movie. And she says, more or less, hey, I read to the end of the diary and it turns out to defeat Freddy, you just got to not be afraid of him. And it's like, shouldn't you have read the diary and got to the end of it a little faster than this? And so anyways, she's like, yeah, just don't be afraid of him. And well, he ends up getting possessed by him, and then you have this whole sequence at the boiler compound where Freddy has fully possessed Jesse and Lisa tries to save him. She ends up kissing him because she knows it's really Jesse on the inside, and then that defeats Freddy because she's no longer afraid of him, right? Which, by the way, I think that idea of just, hey, don't be afraid of him is just a really cheap and lame way to defeat Freddy. They also really go pretty much the exact same route as the original film by doing sort of the I'm no longer afraid, we defeated him, cut to final scene, oh, he's back, this is really a dream, and it's not over, Freddy survives. So they really kind of copy the original. I will say, too, I think it works in the original, and I'm glad, as much as I complimented Wes Craven and his decisions, I'm glad that that decision didn't hold, because Craven wanted to end it on a happy note, but got overruled. And I think that if the film had ended one scene earlier, the original, I just think that's a really cheap and lame way to sort of defeat this great villain. Oh, just don't be afraid of him anymore. And it's like, eh. I guess there's a way to execute that well, but anyways, so I'm glad the original film did not end like that, but this film, it really just copies the original exactly, and we are on to part number 3 at this point. So anyways, that felt like a long ramble, but those are my thoughts on Nightmare on Elm Street 2, Freddy's Dead. So overall, there is some decent, there is a few good scenes here. There is some interesting stuff here, but overall, just really them jacking with the rules and totally changing that just doesn't really work for me. I'm probably going to be at like probably a 4 out of 10 for Nightmare on Elm 2. So those are my thoughts. Up next is Nightmare on Elm Street 3, Dream Warriors, and I'm looking forward to it. So we will see you then on The Haunted Beard.